Good afternoon, Madam Lillian, and today we are going to look at this unit, which is Geography of Natural Hazards. We shall start with the definition and the characteristics of a hazard. First, a hazard is believed to be a potentially damaging physical event, phenomenon, or human activity that may cause the loss of life, injury, property damage, social and economic disruption, or even environment degradation. Hazards can be of different origins, which can be one, natural, or induced by human processes, which can be from human activities. We have the word risk, which goes well with the word hazard, and it means that the probability of harmful consequences or expected losses, which can be death, injuries, loss of property, livelihoods, economic activity disrupted, or even environmental damages resulting from interactions between natural or human-induced hazards and vulnerable conditions. We have the the word disaster. A disaster is a sudden calamitous event that disrupts the functioning of a community, that causes human, material, economic, or environment losses that exceed the community or society's ability to cope using their own resources, thus causing a lot of damages. We have the word vulnerability from the word vulnerable, whereby it's the conditions determined by physical, social, economic, and environmental factors or processes which increase the susceptibility of a community to the impacts of hazards. Moving on, we have the classification of hazards, which are four of them. One, natural, hydrometeorological, geological, and biological. We shall look at the characteristics of hazards. One, which is magnitude, which describes the strength or force of an event. Where we find that in case of floods, for example, magnitude is often described as the maximum height of flood waters above average sea level, flood stage, or simply above ground. We have frequency, which describes how often an event of a given magnitude or intensity occurs. This can be in qualitative terms such as frequent or rare, whereby for floods, a reoccurrence interval of 10 years suggests that in any year, a flood of that magnitude has 1 in 10, which is 10%, has a 10% chance of occurring, which we find it's so rare. We have the other characteristic, which is duration, as another temporal dimension that describes how long an event persists. This is the time it takes before it disappears. For example, floods may last for weeks, while droughts may last for years. We have the areal extent, which is the measure of space covered by an event, whereby we find some hazards like a tornado or a small gasoline spill may have a small areal extent compared to droughts, compared to drought, which may affect a large geographical area. Moving on swiftly, we shall look at lesson 2, which is the spatial and temporal variations of hazards. In this topic, we shall look at the trends in impact of hazards, whereby in our daily life we find that hazards are happening more often and are having a more dramatic impact on the world in terms of both their human and economic costs. In the past 20 years, the number of lives lost has declined, whereby 80,000 people have died from natural disasters in the 1990s compared to the 1970s, where there was loss of about 2 million people. We look at the first trend, which is the hydrometeorological hazards. Societies are increasingly affected by interannual variations in climate, such as those associated with El Nino or rather El La Nina, which affects precipitation and temperature on interannual timescales that are only predictable to some degree. Trends in geological hazards. Earthquakes and volcanic eruptions represent the classic rapid onset and the sudden impact hazards. The regional distribution of earthquakes and volcanoes is closely related to the geophysical activities associated with the tectonic plates. We have the trends in biological hazards, where we find a wide range of diseases originated or transmitted by organisms that affect people, their crops, and are considered biological hazards. Exposure to biological hazards is in many cases linked to the damage of other natural is linked to the causes of other natural hazards such as floods, drought, and storms. Moving on, we shall look at the factors responsible for the increasing vulnerability of developing countries. The first one is demographic factors, whereby 90% of the global population growth occurs in developing countries. In these countries, exposure to hazards is already high through dense concentrations of population in hazardous areas and in cities that are poorly suited to address the needs of the rapid growth in that area. The second factor is poverty. Vulnerability to hazards is closely associated with poverty, whereby in the sub-Saharan areas in Africa, poverty levels remain high, especially in the remote areas. Under these conditions, it is unrealistic to expect significant investment at household or national levels to mitigate the impact of natural or other threats. We have globalization, whereby the impact of globalization on patterns of vulnerability is critical to identify new trends in disaster risk and the impacts of economic adjustment measures to encourage greater efficiencies and global competitiveness have commonly resulted in shrinking job markets. We have technological and cultural changes as the last factor. Mm, Now let's look at the interaction between man and hazards as our other topic, whereby when seeking to use natural resources for our benefit, we find that we often expose ourselves to forces of nature that adversely affect our settlements and activities. These extreme natural events include severe winds, floods and droughts, earthquakes, landslides, and bacterial infections. These hazards have got effects on us as human beings, which include cost and losses of hazards, which are either direct or indirect. The direct effects of a hazard are those that are directly related to the occurrence of a physical phenomenon, including the adverse damage on persons and infrastructure. Indirect effects are those impacts that are causally related to the direct effects and losses. Examples include the loss of production opportunities and future income and increases in poverty levels. We have gains, or rather the beneficial aspects of hazards. Natural hazards are regarded as undesirable phenomena since the bulk of public policy is directed towards their reduction or elimination. This assumption cannot always be justified since it is clear that hazardous events can produce benefits as well. The last one is intangible consequences of hazards, whereby there are many effects of natural hazards which cannot be evaluated on a cost-benefit basis. Basing on the number of these have particular significance for theories of landscape development and developments. That will be the end of our lesson. On the next class, we shall look at the factors influencing human occupancy of hazard areas, which you shall look at them before the next class. Have a nice day. Bye.